Okay, hopefully we are recording now, and I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Bob Bifus. I am a retired extension agent from Greene County, New York, and I've been presenting classes on growing mushrooms as well as identifying wild mushrooms for many years now for Cornell Cooperative Extension. And I'm delighted to have you in the audience and to have Christy arranging for this Zoom PowerPoint meeting. I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson today on identifying some wild mushrooms that are in the Catskill Mountains, actually pretty much throughout New York State and even other states too. So that is the topic. If you have any questions and, out of the regular structure, you can always email me at rlb14@cornell.edu. So look forward to seeing you all in person in a couple of weeks out at the Arnott Forest. So to begin with, we'll talk a little bit what mushrooms are, and I'll begin by saying that all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. Mushrooms are actually the reproductive structure of fungi, and of course they can grow almost anywhere you can imagine. For many years, people thought that fungi were some sort of plant that had lost its chlorophyll, as there are some plants that has happened to, but they're not. And since they're not plants, some people said, well, they're like animals. Well, actually, they're not like animals either, but they do share characteristics of both fungi, or I should say both plants and of fungi. You might want to think of them as sort of a seasonal fruit, and they are born from a much, much larger perennial structure. So they're the fruit of the fungi that's growing. And as I said, they're likely to be found almost anywhere. Piles of mulch, rotting wood, bare soil, logs, structural wood. Not good if you see them growing out of the rafters of your house, that indicates you've got some rot up there. But they'll grow on dead animals, insect bodies, they'll grow in your garden. Some mushrooms even grow on rocks. Basically, any type of decomposing organic matter may produce mushrooms because they are saprophytes. They do not contain chlorophyll, they cannot photosynthesize, so therefore they can only survive by decomposing organic matter and extracting the nutrients from that organic matter. But it is important to note where the mushrooms may be growing. That's sometimes a very important identification trait that you want to keep in mind. It's kind of unusual. These mushrooms are actually pushing their way up through a hard-packed gravel driveway. And it just shows that mushrooms, even though they're soft-fleshed, they have incredible power. In this case, it's actually cracked that hard-packed gravel, and the mushrooms are pushing up through that gravel right there. And mysteriously, not here today, but they may very well pop up and be full size tomorrow. I've got right now in my lawn, I've got a couple of mushrooms that are 7 or 8 inches tall, and they were not even present yesterday. So they do pop up unexpectedly, and some of them do look like phalluses, as this comic is indicating here. There's a whole genus of mushrooms called phallus, and some of them do resemble penises. Kind of an interesting mushroom here. This is growing on dead caterpillars, or in this case, mealworms. This is a species of mushroom called cordyceps. And all cordyceps mushrooms grow on dead insect bodies. And many cordyceps mushrooms are actually considered to be very important medicinal mushrooms. And they're deliberately cultured and grown in some cases. In some cases, they're collected wild. And they're used in many types of traditional Chinese medicine. So again, these mushrooms happen to be growing on dead mealyworms. It's kind of an unusual slide. One of the few times I've seen mushrooms specifically growing on a mushroom. In this case, the host is a fairly common mushroom that I pick this one and eat it sometimes, but in this case, this mushroom has got mushrooms growing on it. So here's a few terms that you should probably learn, and you need to learn a lot of terms if you're going to speak the language of mushrooms, but here's a couple to begin with, and they're quite important. Mycelium it's usually hidden, but it's the part of the fungus that grows underground if the mushrooms are coming out of the ground, or it grows within a particular substrate. Let's say they're growing out of a log or something, or they're growing out of your rafters. Myceliums generally tend to look very much alike, even for very, very different types of fungi. Quite often it's thread-like, often white, almost always white usually, and when conditions are right for any particular species, mushroom or mycelium will produce pinheads. And pinheads are nothing more than little tiny undeveloped mushrooms. And this is a drawing of some string-like mycelium and the very, very beginning of pinheads, which within, in some cases, less than 8 hours will grow into full-size mushrooms. You can see on figure 3 on the right there that this pinhead has actually got a couple mushrooms attached to it. And that's not uncommon for that to happen very, very quickly. So I'm going to show you some parts of a typical mushroom here, and this typical mushroom that I've chosen for this illustration is typical of a family of very poisonous mushrooms. And I'm going to be talking a lot about poisonous mushrooms because there's a huge concern about safety when we're teaching mushroom classes, and I'd be remiss if I did not spend a lot of time talking about them. So this is a typical mushroom that is in the genus and in the family of Amanita. It has a stalk, which is sometimes called a stipe. It has a ring of tissue around the stalk. That ring is sometimes called an annulus, or more technically, it's called an annulus. It has a cap, which makes sense. And this particular mushroom has gills. It does not have pores. It's, again, it's typical in the sense that many mushrooms have gills. This particular mushroom also has a vulva, which is a swollen basal portion. Sometimes it looks like an egg or a cup that surrounds the stalk. And sometimes it actually looks like a mushroom is emerging from an egg and growing a stalk and growing a cap. And the ring is quite often tissue that remains from the cap as the cap expands. So this is a typical Amanita mushroom, which is a typical of a poisonous species of mushroom. And of course, not all mushrooms are typical. This particular mushroom is what's known as lion's mane, or sometimes it's called a bear-tooth fungus. Doesn't have a cap, doesn't have a stalk, it just has fungal tissue growing out of the side of a tree. In this case, I think it's a beech tree. And the spores for this mushroom would be shed from those icicle-like projections that you see dangling. In the previous slide, the spores would drop from the gills. And I'll talk more about gills and spores and spore prints as we go on. Now, some mushrooms, if you turn them upside down, you will see the gills, as you can clearly see in the mushroom on your left there. And on the right, you see a mushroom that doesn't have gills. It has pores. In this case, the pores are where the spores, which you can sort of think of as seeds, will be dropped and will be shed. Mushroom on the left, again, has got gills. And those gills, in this particular mushroom, are going to change color. They're starting out as pink, and they're going to end up as a chocolate brown color. It's a fairly common edible mushroom that I'll talk about in a little while. And of course, some mushrooms like that lion's mane mushroom have neither gills nor pores. On the left here is my late friend John Boyle, who taught me most of what I know about mycology, at least about mushrooms. He's got his hand on a puffball, which is a easy to identify, actually quite tasty species when it's fresh of mushroom that I'll refer to again later on as I talk about some specific mushrooms. And on the right, we have what's known as a coral mushroom. And most coral mushrooms are not toxic. Most of them don't taste particularly good, but some of them can be poisonous. So I generally tell people to avoid coral mushrooms. But again, not at all typical, but they certainly are fungi. So how do mushrooms fruit? Well, generally you need rainfall. It's been a lousy mushroom year up until the past few weeks because it's been so dry. At least here in the Catskills, it's been dry. But in the past couple of weeks, we've had quite a bit of rain and mushrooms are out in force. Quite often a mushroom change is also needed in order to trigger a fruiting. And of course, the mycelium must be of sufficient maturity and health. But there's also carbon dioxide and oxygen levels that may also be involved in fruiting of the mushrooms themselves. And certain mushrooms will really only fruit if they're grown in association with the roots of trees. These are called mycorrhizal mushrooms. And some of the most tasty mushrooms really can only grow when they're in association with the roots of trees. Other mushrooms will grow on pretty much any organic matter, and those are mushrooms that we can generally grow ourselves just by duplicating the conditions, but no one's been able to grow mycorrhizal mushrooms, or at least not the common mycorrhizal mushrooms to my knowledge. And seasons. Most mushrooms are seasonal. Some spring, some midsummer, late summer, or fall. Some of them, including some of the poisonous ones, will fruit all seasons. And some are actually found even in the winter or very early spring. I've actually gone out and found fresh mushrooms when the ambient temperature was 10 degrees or less, which means that they're capable of withstanding freezing temperatures. And quite unusual, surprising to see a fresh mushroom growing at 10 degrees. Typically in the same spot during the same season most years, except like this year, for example, when we've had very little rain. Consequently, the mushrooms that I was expecting back in July did not show up. No rain, no mushrooms. Now, this is an example of don't be fooled by a pretty face. This mushroom that this young woman is holding is a poisonous species of mushroom. It's Amanita muscaria. And if you look at it, you can see that it does have the characteristics of that so-called typical mushroom that I showed you before. It's got the swollen base that she's got her hand around. That's called the vulva. And you can barely see it above her left hand, but there is a ring on the stalk of that. And it's got a large flat cap. If you could see the gills, you would see that they're white. And it has scales on top of the cap, which is another common characteristic of many of these poisonous species of Amanitas. We'll warn you that those scales can wash off in the rain, and that veil or that annulus that surrounds the stalk, that can also be washed off by rain. So even though those are pretty important diagnostic characteristics, they're not always present. I've seen this exact same mushroom with no scales on the top. And the color of the cap can also vary a great deal. This one happens to be bright red, but I've seen the same exact mushroom with a pale red, an orange colored cap, in some cases even a yellow colored cap. So cap color is not as reliable indicator of a particular species as one might think it would be. One might think that it's got a red cap. It always has a red cap, but that's not always the case. And by the way, this young woman in the picture here is a former Arnott intern. Janine Moy is her name, and she is now living somewhere in the state of Washington, one of our former Arnott students. So what are the characteristics of poisonous mushrooms? Well, actually, very few species are deadly. Unfortunately, the deadly ones are fairly common. And it's kind of a glib saying, but all mushrooms are edible, some only once. Well, that's a fact, because the poisonous ones are not going to warn you necessarily by tasting terrible. And if you pick that Amanita mushroom, for example, the destroying angel that I'll talk about, it's actually been reported to taste quite good. So again, you can't let taste fool you. Some just make you very, very sick. There's not a lot, but there are a number of species that are hallucinogenic. Generally, the textbooks will refer to them as poisonous. Some of them will just refer to them as hallucinogenic. Many are both. Don't take chances. Some just give you a bellyache. Even some mushrooms that most people can eat without any problem will make other people sick. Some of them just taste terrible. You wouldn't want to eat them even if they're not poisonous. And some species will make some people sick, but not most people. I know there's a particular mushroom that's coming out now called honey mushroom, and about 10% of the people that eat that mushroom, it's been reported, get pretty sick from it, but most people don't. One important thing is that all mushrooms should be thoroughly cooked. You should never, ever eat a raw mushroom, and that goes for the ones you buy in the supermarket as well. Even though you'll see them in salad bars, you'll see these button mushrooms along with the raw vegetables. Very smart mushroom person named Paul Stamets strongly recommends that all mushrooms should be thoroughly cooked before you eat them, because they all contain certain toxins, and some of these toxins may be destroyed by cooking. I will point out, though, that not the poisonous mushrooms, the deadly ones, those toxins are not at all affected by cooking. So cooking is not going to render a poisonous mushroom edible. And this is the Amanita family. This is a mushroom that I referred to before. I showed you the early slides. You can see that it's beautiful white mushroom. These can be anywhere from 4 to 8 or 9 inches tall. White cap, it's got a white stalk, it's got a white vulva at the base, it's got a white ring of tissue around it. This is called the destroying angel, Amanita verosa, and it is deadly poisonous. Eating a cap of one of these mushrooms is a fatal dose. It's a delayed reaction. People generally may just get mildly ill when they first ingest it, or not ill at all. But within 48 hours, it destroys the liver, and unless you can get a liver toxin, it is fatal. Angel of Death is the common name. Another view of it showing the white crowded gills, the stalk, the ring, and also the vulva at the base with my penknife there for scale. This mushroom is probably about 6 inches tall. It's another Amanita. This is probably the same species as the one that I showed you that Janine was holding with the red cap and the white scales. This may very well be Amanita muscaria, or it could be another Amanita. And again, generally speaking, avoid all Amanitas. This one appears to be growing under pine, and that's based on the pine needles that I'm looking at there. Important to make note of where it's growing, as I said earlier. And Amanitas do often grow under pine. They are mycorrhizal with pine. And here's an example of a group of Amanitas that are growing in what's known as a fairy ring, in which case they form a circle, quite common on lawns this time of the year to see these fairy rings, not always Amanitas. There's a number of species that will form fairy rings, but just last week, as I was telling Christy earlier, I got involved in a mushroom poisoning case in which someone had picked some Amanitas off his lawn that were growing in a fairy ring, much like this, and an hour later he was in a coma. Good news is that he did survive. It wasn't a deadly poisonous mushroom, but again, quite often you will see mushrooms growing in these so-called fairy rings. This actually is an edible Amanita, one of the few, and I certainly don't recommend that anyone go out and harvest it unless you're an expert. But you can see how it's also growing out of a vulva. In this case, the vulva looks like a chicken egg, a white chicken egg of which the mushroom appears to have popped out of and is growing out of that chicken egg. So again, it shows the characteristics of the white vulva and the mushroom growing out of it. Can't see the ring, but it also has a ring on the stalk. So what are some of the common characteristics? They all have crowded gills. And you need to look at pictures of gills that are crowded versus free versus distant, just to know pretty much what that term means, because it is an important diagnostic part of the language of mushrooms. They all have white colored spores, and I'm going to show you how to make a spore print in a few minutes. Most of them have that ring on the stalk. Most of them have the vulva. Many associated with pine trees, common and found all season long. Early in the spring, right up until the late fall. And a lot of them have scales, as this one does on the cap. This is Amanita muscaria. This is the one that Janine was holding. This one happens to have an orange or yellowish colored cap, which fades with sunlight. A couple of button stage mushrooms on the left there. Button is immature mushroom. It's going to grow into the thing on the right. And at the far left of your slide, there's actually what I would call a pinhead. So from pinhead to button to mature mushroom, that can happen in 24 hours or less. Here's another mushroom that's out right now. It's called the deadly Galerina, and I tell my students to beware of most LBMs. LBM stands for little brown mushrooms. This happens to be an LBM that grows on dead logs and rotting wood. It is called the deadly Galerina. It contains the same toxins as Amanita, which are liver poisons. It's a delayed reaction and a very, very horrible death. So on old logs or stumps, usually well-decayed logs or stump, not usually going to find one or two there, and quite often they'll be joined at the base. Show up usually in August and continue until November. They have a reddish-brown cap, quite small, again, LBM, might be a half an inch to as much as 2 inches wide. The gills are gray to rusty colored. They also have a ring, a small ring on the stalk. And the spores are rusty or brown colored spores. And those guys out there who are colorblind, well, you've got a real disadvantage when it comes to identifying mushrooms, because some of the colors that mushrooms take on are really quite subtle. And my experience with colorblind guys is that they have a hard time seeing some of the colors that you really need to distinguish. So if you're trying to identify mushrooms, you need to have a woman nearby. Okay, so here we have the deadly Galerina, which is on the right. And we have an edible honey mushroom, Armillaria malea, which is on the left. Kind of similar in many ways. The shape of the mushroom's the same. They both have a ring at the stalk, slightly different colored gills, and if you did a spore print, you would clearly see that the Armillaria mushroom has white spores And the deadly Galerina mushroom on the right has got rusty brown spores. To be safe, don't eat either of them. Don't even try, because this is a mushroom that can be confused. Commonly called the honey mushroom, mushroom that makes some people sick anyway, and probably not something that you should be out there looking for or foraging for. And jack-o'-lanterns, Omphaliotis. Omphaliotis illudens is the name of this mushroom. Beautiful mushroom. I don't think I've ever seen quite as many jack-o'-lanterns as I have this past 2 weeks. They tend to fruit at the base of trees. Quite often they're in large clumps or clusters, and quite often they're joined at the base. The caps are this orange color, as you can see here. They are reported to glow in the dark if you get a very, very dark night, producing this eerie green color, which has been called foxfire. Back in the day when we didn't have any much light pollution, people reported seeing this eerie green glow coming out of the woods in, let's say, late August into September. And in many cases, this glow was caused by these mushrooms. Now, my own experience has been, I've harvested these jack-o'-lanterns, I've put them in dark containers and dark boxes, and I've never seen that green glow. Something I look forward to seeing at some point, though. So it says you can distinguish these from other mushrooms because of the glow. Well, you can't, because they generally don't glow. They do look a bit like chanterelles, but again, if you know mushrooms, you'll notice that the gills really differ markedly. They are found in the same season and in the same habitat. I've seen poisonous jack-o'-lanterns growing a foot away from edible chanterelles. It seems to me that the jack-o'-lanterns are more pumpkin colored, and they have bright orange caps, whereas chanterelles usually are more yellow colored. But jack-o'-lanterns have very thin descending gills that are very crowded close to each other, and again, may or may not glow in the dark, whereas chanterelles have more ridges. They don't really have thin gills per se. Looks like gills, but they're actually ridges, and they also grow down the stalk. Again, jacks grow always from either buried wood, stumps, or underground wood, clusters. And they both have a whitish spore deposit. So you can't just take it's not like the deadly Galerina, which can be distinguished from the edible honey mushroom, the Armillaria, by the spore print. You really can't tell because both jack-o'-lantern and chanterelles have whitish colored spore deposits. In many cases, the jack-o'-lanterns will have a nipple on the cap, which chanterelles will never have. Chanterelles almost always have funnel-shaped caps as they mature, although young chanterelles may have a flat cap, but they never have this nipple on the cap. And again, here we have a poisonous jack-o'-lantern on the left, and we have an edible chanterelle on the right. To me, they don't look very much alike at all, but believe me, in some cases, they do look alike. Now, jack often fruit in large clusters, such as this. Chanterelles never fruit like this. Chanterelles grow in troops, which means there's a scattering of them here one place, here someplace else. But they rarely will have, you'll never find chanterelles that are fused at the base, such as this. Not 5 or 6 of them or 10 of them, in this case, that are fused at the base. You can see a little bit of the nipple on the cap in this slide. This is a new slide that I will add to the collection. Now, if we change from the gilled mushrooms to a pored mushroom, for a change here, we're looking at a mushroom that does not have gills, it has pores. Mushrooms with pores such as this are generally and generically referred to as boletes. Many, many species of boletes, very common, they're out right now. Most boletes are not poisonous, however, this one is. In general, students avoid any bolete that has red-colored pores, such as this one does. Red-colored boletes are the poisonous ones. Most boletes are not poisonous, but avoid any red-pored boletes. I had a student once took my course and was out in the woods with a friend of hers from Europe who was not an American, but he said he knew the mushrooms, and they came upon some red-pored boletes. He swore that they were edible. He had eaten them in his home, Poland, many, many times and proceeded to eat some raw. And that fellow spent the next 3 days in urgent care, in the emergency room, actually, and almost died from mushroom poisoning. So don't eat any red-pored boletes. Pretty to look at, but don't eat them. Okay, spore prints. This is probably the most important thing you need to know when you're identifying mushrooms because if you try to work your way through mushroom keys, probably the first or the second question they're going to ask you is what color are the spores? Because that is diagnostic. Now, a lot of mushrooms will only shed their spores for a few days when they first come up, so they need to be fresh. Some of them will make no spores whatsoever after 3 or 4 days. They just don't drop any spores. So the procedure is to cut off the cap, and then you want to place the cap gill or pore side down on a surface that will show both light-colored and dark-colored spores. So you want to position the cap so that half of it's over dark paper and half of it's over on white paper. And sometimes you want to make sure you cover that, because if it's someplace where the wind blows, spores can be blown away by the wind. And the spore prints will develop sometimes in a few hours, or sometimes they'll take overnight. This is also a new slide. And what I've done is I've taken just a regular kitchen placemat, which is white on the underside. I forget what's on the outside. But anyway, I've turned this over, and then I have taped a couple of black pieces of paper to that, so I can position the mushroom so that half of it is on the black colored surface and half of it is on the white colored surface. And you can see at the top left there, that mushroom left a very, very distinct chocolate brown spore print. That happens to be an agaricus, and that's diagnostic for that particular species. Really good spore print, really easy to see. You can even get the pattern of the gills from looking at that. Right next to that, in the middle, is a chanterelle, and you can just see a faint whitish colored spore print between those two. One's a chanterelle, they're both chanterelles there, but you can just see a fairly white spore print. In the middle of your slide, there is a much clearer spore print. That's a white spore print, and that's from an oyster mushroom, another common, fairly easy recognized edible mushroom that can be distinguished by its white spore print. And then on the right, we have a mushroom, top right, that you can't see it in the slide, but it actually had a pink spore print. And then below that, bottom right of your slide, you have a shiitake mushroom, which is a mushroom that I grow, very commonly grown, which also produces a whitish spore print. So how do you identify them? Well, again, first thing is note the specific location where you find it and what substrate it's growing on. Is it growing on a log? Is it growing in the grass on your lawn? Is it growing under a pine tree? Is it growing under a hemlock tree? Is it growing under a larch tree? Those are all important steps. What's the condition? Mushrooms will change as they age, and what look very, very different when they're old compared to when they're young. It's hard to identify old mushrooms in general. And how many are there? What's their distribution? Are they all growing together in a clump? Are they separated? Are they growing in troops? Are they growing individually? Make a spore print, very important. And then you work through your key. If you're going to identify mushrooms, you're going to have to learn how to use a dichotomous key. Dichotomous key will ask you two questions, such as spores white, spores not white. So if the spores are white, you go to number 2, and then it'll ask you another 2 questions. So the keys are dichotomous. Again, you can't read the key unless you can speak the language. It's almost like trying to read a newspaper that's written in a foreign language. You may know a few of the words, but unless you can understand the language of the newspaper, you're not going to get it. So you need to learn the language of the mushroom keys. Photograph, very important. Take good pictures, and I'll give you a slide in a minute on how to take a good picture. Take notes and talk with others. Best way to learn about mushrooms is to hook up with a mushroom club. There's a bunch of them all across New York State. Mid-Hudson has got a good one. New York City's got a great mushroom club. Very, very active, but the best way to learn is from others. I would never eat a mushroom that I keyed out myself using only a book. You know, I really would need to have some human being telling me, you know, what that mushroom is. So again, the keys are great. They'll get you on the right page, but the best way to learn is to confer with others. And you have to learn the language. For example, the cap. Well, what shape does that cap? Is it conical or is it bell-shaped? Is it convex? Is it knobbed? Is it flat? Is it sunken? Or all of the above at different stages of growth, because a mushroom may start out with a very, very much bell-shaped cap, and it may end up with an upturned cap. It may go from convex to concave in some cases, or concave, I should say, to convex. And what's the surface like? Is it smooth? Is it velvety? Is it slimy? Is it hairy? Or is it fibrous? Sometimes on the wettest day, you would think all mushroom caps will be slimy, and sometimes on the driest day, certain species of mushrooms will be slimy. Something I don't have a slide here and I should, but you really need to take a smell too. Some mushrooms are easily identified by their smell. There's one that's out now, it's called the almond-scented rucola, which is a very common mushroom, and the smell is a dead giveaway of what it is. It's not edible. And again, does the cap have raised scales? Are the scales flat? Or do they have patches of scales? Part of learning the language is working the way through the keys. Look at the gills. Are the gills crowded? Or maybe just close to each other, or are they distant? Got to know what that means. Are they attached to the stalk? Also an important diagnostic characteristic, whether they attach to the stalk or run down the stalk, or whether you could easily break the gills from the stalk with no attachment. The pores. Are the pores pin size, or are the pores much, much larger than that? Do the stalks have rings? And even the characteristics of the ring are subject to interpretation. Some of them are pendant, some of them are flaring or sheathing. Some of these sheaths may appear to be like cobwebs. And the stalks. Stalk might be straight up and down like a pencil. It could be club shaped, or it could be bulbous. Very important. Right now, one of the tasty mushrooms out now has got a very bulbous stalk. One of my favorite mushrooms called the bluet. And do the stalks come out? The stalks come from a cup or appear rooted in the ground? If you pull the mushroom out of the ground, does it appear to have rhizomorphs, which appear to be white roots? Now, as far as taking good pictures is concerned, well, you want a good picture of the cap. Okay, in this case, the mushroom that's illustrated here is a type of a bolete. It has pores, not gills. So after you take a picture of the cap, you want to take a side picture where you can actually take a look at the stipe or the stalk. Also want to get a little of that mycelium, which is attached at the base of the stipe. And particularly for boletes, you want to make a cross section because that's the best way to see if they're buggy or not. You want to slice that thing longitudinally, and you can see how this one has turned all sorts of interesting colors. Your knife blade has actually provoked an oxidation response in which you're getting color changes as a result of cutting into it with your knife. Again, looking at the pores, does it stain a color? In other words, if you take your knife and you score it, such as this, in some cases, and I wish I had a video of this, and I will have a video of it at some future point, the color will change dramatically. You'll get an almost instant blue or green color just as soon as you make that cut. In some cases, that'll happen 5 or 10 minutes later. Sometimes just handling a mushroom will cause it to bruise a particular color after a period of time. Again, that is diagnostic. And again, what's the size of the pores? You know, are these pores attached? In this case, the pores are attached to the stalk itself. And again, the size of the pores. And then finally, the habitat of where they're growing. So when you're taking a good picture, all of these things are really important to include in your picture. If you post it on Facebook, some idiot's going to try to identify the mushroom, even if they can't, because it's not a good enough picture. But if you post good pictures, quite often you'll get pretty good answers. I got to caution you about Facebook. There's some very good mushroom pages on Facebook, some very expert people doing identifications. But unfortunately, there is a number of places where people will just guess, and invariably someone will agree with the incorrect guess. So beware of Facebook. So here's a few things I've also come up before. Have I seen this before? When? You know, I tend to make notes of in my mushroom book, which I'll show you the book that I use later on. If I've seen a mushroom, it makes it a little bit easier to narrow it down sometimes if I take a yellow sticky paper and mark that particular page. I am more of a mushroom meat eater. I don't generally, more so lately, but I generally don't identify mushrooms just for the heck of it. If it's not enough to eat, I'm really not interested. I mean, there's so many tiny, tiny mushrooms, little tiny white mushrooms, and I really don't care what they are because I usually like to eat the mushrooms I find. And again, what condition is it in? There's lots of edible mushrooms that have been rendered inedible because they've got bugs or slugs and they're just rotted. They're just disgusting. Very important to note if there's any poisonous lookalikes. That's why you learn the poisonous one first. Look for staining, not just pored mushrooms like bolete stain, but others might stain as well. And I generally tell people to ignore most of your LBMs and most of the bracket fungi, which are fungi that grow out of the sides of trees. There's a couple of good ones that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Now I'm going to give you a quick lesson in a couple of the edible mushrooms. Try to get these seasonal. most of these are hard to confuse with poisonous ones. And there is a difference between edible versus good versus choice. Um, I don't eat mushrooms that are edible if they're just edible. They have to be either good or choice in order for me to eat them. I had a young fellow who kept sending me pictures of mushrooms, asking me over and over and over again, is this edible? Is this edible? Well, I got a little bit tired of that, and I finally said, yeah, this is an edible species, but I knew darn well that it was not a tasty mushroom. So he wrote back to me and said, well, I ate it and it really didn't taste good at all. And I said, I didn't say it was good. I said it was edible. So as far as I'm concerned, if it's not very good or choice, I'm not interested. First mushrooms we find in any quantity, if you're lucky, are morel mushrooms. These are pretty hard to confuse with anything. They usually appear in May in most of New York State. They can be locally abundant. You can sometimes pick that many in a little 10-foot by 10-foot patch, but they're not at all predictable. Morels tend to show up when conditions are just right for morels, and they may not show up in that same spot for 10 years or more later. They're not predictable like many mushrooms are, but in a good morel year, they can be quite abundant, and they really are quite tasty. And very few mushrooms out there. There's one other species, one other genus of mushrooms that I'll talk about that may be confused with them, but these are pretty easy. They look like brains on stalks. Okay, the only mushroom you might confuse them with, and by this slide I could see why that might happen, is a verpa, which is a false morel. Generally a different season. Verpas usually are fall mushrooms. Morels are spring mushrooms, as I said. Morels are completely hollow. If you slice them open longitudinally like this, you'll see that they're completely hollow. If you slice a verpa open, you'll see that that stalk is not hollow and the cap itself is not really hollow per se. So that's a distinguishing feature between morels and the false morel. The morels are pretty good stuffed with cream cheese. That's probably the best way I like to eat them. But again, the verpa, the false morel, not a hollow stalk. Oyster mushrooms, very common. Quite often one of the early spring mushrooms. Almost always are growing out of a dead or dying tree and usually just about 6 inches above where you can reach. That's why you need someone to help you harvest these. Oysters have little to no stalk. They might have a little sideways stalk that comes out of the trunk of the tree. And they tend to get buggy very, very quickly. So oyster mushrooms, usually within 24 hours of emergence, will quite often get buggy. They'll appear on the same tree. I've harvested 5 and 6 times from the same dead maple tree on near my property. I've harvested crops of oyster mushrooms from that same tree 3 or 4 times a year for the last 5 years. I don't know what's keeping that tree alive, and that's not alive, what's keeping that tree standing, but eventually that will quit producing oyster mushrooms. This is kind of an interesting mushroom. It's an oyster mushroom. It's called a golden oyster because it's got this yellow golden color to it. And in the past few years, this mushroom has become extremely common. Likes to grow on dead elm. That's probably the most favored substrate, but I've also seen it growing on sugar maple. It's a cultivated mushroom that's native to Asia that somehow has escaped cultivation, particularly in the Hudson Valley is where this started. And now it's really quite common. It grows all over New York, so obviously it's escaped cultivation in many other places. I'm sure some people would consider it an invasive species because it's not native, but it's a very tasty mushroom and easy to identify. And it actually keeps a lot better than most of the native oyster mushrooms. Several species of native oyster mushrooms, most of which we can cultivate. And this is a cultivated species from Asia that is now growing wild, usually produces huge clusters and clumps. And abundant. Yeah, it's not at all hard to pick 5 or 6 or 7 pounds of these at a single fruiting. This is a common mushroom in the spring. Generally don't see this much after June or it gets rotted. This is called dryad saddle. Notice the scales on the top that I referred to. It's also called pheasant's back. Well, I've seen plenty of pheasants and I've never seen one that looked exactly like that. It's a fleshy fungus. It grows out of the side of hardwoods. I have not seen this grown off softwoods. Generally grows laterally off the side of a dead or dying hardwood tree. Yes, it is edible, but it's terrible. I don't think it tastes particularly good. It's very, very tough. I think they call it dryad saddle because most of the mushroom has the texture of a saddle. It's tough. But if you found a very young, very fresh specimen, and if you took your scissors and just cut right around the outer perimeter, maybe the outer inch or so, if you cook that long enough, yeah, it's edible. And some people have reported it tastes like watermelon. I think it tastes more like the rind of a watermelon than it does a watermelon, but it is considered an edible mushroom. It's a pretty easy mushroom to identify, again, by the scales. It's pores, by the way. This mushroom has pores on the underside, does not have gills. This is another common mushroom that grows off the side of a tree. It's called a reishi mushroom. It's not considered an edible mushroom except for making tea, but reishi mushroom is widely used as a traditional Chinese medicine, as a tea, the mushroom of immortality. This one happens to grow off hemlock and only on hemlock. Hemlock being Tsuga canadensis, and this happens to be, this mushroom, the Latin name is Ganoderma tsugi, which means it's a Ganoderma type mushroom. It has pores that grows on hemlock trees. These are my grandkids. This is about, oh gosh, it must be probably 4 years now, and they don't look like that anymore. Again, not considered an edible species, but got a very shiny, reddish, almost a varnished cap color, kind of brownish underneath, and used for making tea, which is considered to be very healthy, very beneficial. Fairly common, starts growing in the spring. By now they're getting kind of bug infested at this time of the season. There's a couple more bracket fungi that also in the species Ganoderma, they get huge. They're growing on a probably still living sugar maple tree, and I can almost sit on these. That's how large they are. This happens to be the artist conch, which has got a white underside of pores. And if you take your fingernail or a stick, you can write your initials on there and come back 10 years from now, that mushroom will still be growing, and you can clearly see your initials because it turns black as soon as you scour it with any type of a sharp object. So this happens to be the artist's conch. This is chaga, also a medicinal species, but this one makes a very good tasting tea as opposed to reishi, which makes a very bitter tea. This makes a very tasty tea. Weird looking mushroom because it grows this black, dark growth that grows laterally off the side of a birch tree. Not only birch, but almost always birch. In this case, it's growing out of a yellow birch. These are probably the two largest chagas I've ever seen in my life growing off this yellow birch tree. But these are collected usually in the winter and brewed into a tea called the anti-cancer mushroom. The folk use of this mushroom is supposedly something that prevents people from getting cancer, or I won't say it cures cancer, but it is also a very popular species. You can go online, by the way, and you can Google chaga and Google any of these mushrooms, and you'll learn a good deal about them. I've seen chaga powder for sale for $15, $25 for a few grams, and you can harvest a whole couple pounds of it for no cost at all, as I do. This is another mushroom that occurs in a wild form as well as one that can be cultivated. This happens to be Stropharia. Okay, Stropharia is an interesting mushroom because you can buy the mycelium or the spawn for Stropharia. You can grow it in piles of wood chips. I've grown this mushroom commonly out at the Arnott Forest. The wild strain has got a red cap. It's called Stropharia rugosa annulata, rugosa referring to the red color, annulata referring to the fact that it does have a very pronounced ring, when it gets a little bit bigger than this. This mushroom can get huge. This is the more common wild form with the red cap there, also the cultivated one. But I want you to notice in this picture of those string root-like things coming off the bottom, appear to be like roots, string-like roots. Those are called rhizomorphs, and those are important diagnostic characteristics. Not a lot of mushrooms produce those rhizomorphs, so it's important to note those that do. And you can see here, right at the bottom of your slide in the center, you can see the ring that forms, the annulus that forms. That is actually tissue from the cap of the mushroom that remains as the cap expands. If you look you can see some of the smaller mushrooms, the cap is not fully expanded, but you can see the formation of that ring or that annulus as the cap is beginning to expand. Diagnostic feature here is the rhizomorphs. This one happens to have dark purple, almost black colored spores. Lactarius. Lactarii are very common mushrooms in the woods. They're out now. What distinguishes them from all other mushrooms is that they produce milky juice. They lactate, basically. Lactarius come from lactate. And in some cases, there's one species called the voluminous Lactarius, Lactarius voluminosus, which if as soon as you break a bit of the gill, the thing almost gushes out liquid, white colored liquid. But there are some Lactarius that have yellow liquid. There are some that have blue liquid. And not all Lactarius, by the way. The Lactarius are the gilled mushrooms on the top of the slide. There's some coral mushrooms and there's a bolete on the bottom of the slide. So I'm only talking about the mushroom at the top of the slide here, which is a species of Lactarius. Some of these are really quite tasty. Some of them are very, very bitter. None of them are deadly. This is one of the few mushrooms I'll actually taste with my tongue, just the liquid itself that it's exuding, because that's the easiest way to distinguish the really, really bitter one from a really tasty one. Of course, the really bitter one is not one that you want to eat. You'll be, even if you taste it with your tongue, you're still going to be spitting for a while. This happens to be Lactarius indigo, which produces a very blue, almost a cobalt blue latex. It is an edible species, easy to identify. I don't know any other mushroom that produces a blue latex when it's wounded, such as this one does. They turn black when you cook them, though, and a lot of people don't find that particularly appetizing. So lion's mane, I showed you a slide earlier of lion's mane. This is one that was actually intentionally grown on a bolt of aspen wood. And quite often you will find lion's mane. They're coming out now, and you'll see them sometimes on sugar maple, sometimes on aspen. And this is one that, or birch, quite often on birch. And this is one that generally grows from year to year. The ones that grow on trees may be the size of a golf, not of a golf ball, maybe the size of a tennis ball. Sometimes they'll be bigger than that, but typically, the size of a tennis ball up to a softball. This is a very tasty mushroom for most people who eat it. It's called the chicken of the woods. It's got a bright orange top color, and it has bright yellow pores underneath it. There's a look-alike to this mushroom that has got sort of a yellow-orange top color, but it's got a white underside, and it's not nearly as tasted. This one happens to be called Laetoporus sulphurus because of the sulfur yellow color of the pores. But there's a Laetoporus cincinnatus, which has got white pores. They're both called chicken of the woods, but this is the only one that actually tastes like chicken, and it really does. This is one, if you get it when it's fresh and you saute it, I usually will parboil it first because some of these, when they're older specimens, do produce kind of a bitter compound. I find that if you boil these for 5 or 10 minutes, discard the boiling water, then you slice them up and saute them, they taste almost identical to chicken breast. I've served people mock chicken casserole, which was made with this, and they really could not tell that it was not made from chicken. That's how much they do taste like chicken. Very common from summer to fall. Grows usually on dead or downed hardwood species. It's been reported to grow on pine and hemlock. I wouldn't eat that one because that's the species that it's been reported to cause stomach aches from. If it's growing on a conifer stump or a conifer log, I probably wouldn't eat it. I would pick it off maple, or I would pick it off oak or beech, for example. But it's a pretty easy mushroom to identify. Again, orange on top, yellow pores. And probably my favorite chanterelle, which is a species of chanterelle that usually shows up in July. This year was a stinko year for chanterelles. I don't think I found any during July. Of course, it didn't rain at all during the month of July, and just finding some now, but not nearly what there should have been. But when these things are abundant, they are abundant. You can see the front seat of my car there. Now that's less than 3 hours picking. This is a mushroom that I sell because, as I said, when they're abundant, and I can sell these for $15 to $20 a pound fresh when I'm the only one that has them. And I can sell them to at a farmer's market, for example, and a few other very specific locations. However, I don't recommend that amateurs try to sell any mushrooms. It's against the law, for the most part, to sell wild mushrooms, unless you're a recognized mushroom expert. Of course, Ag and Markets, which makes the rules, has never really defined what a mushroom expert is. I guess I consider myself a mushroom exit because I'm standing in front of you, or at least I'm standing in front of your computer right now doing this PowerPoint. But I think it's an easy mushroom to identify, and when they're out there, they're abundant. Um, Again, this is an example of selling them at farmers markets. I will sometimes sell these little 4-ounce boxes of chanterelles for $5 or $6 a box, and that works out to $20 or $25 a pound. That's pretty good money. They have to be perfect. You don't want to sell anything that's been slug eaten or bug eaten. But again, when they're abundant, they're abundant. You can also dry them and then reconstitute them during the winter. Now, here what appears to be chanterelles, but if you were listening earlier when I was talking about jack-o'-lantern, I mentioned that jack-o'-lanterns will glow in clusters. I also mentioned that they grow on buried wood, and you might be saying, well, I don't see any buried wood because it's underground. But this is a poisonous jack-o'-lantern mushroom. You don't want to confuse that with the chanterelle. So black trumpets, they're supposed to be out now. They're a type of chanterelle. Pretty hard to confuse them with anything else. They've got kind of a very dark gray to black colored cap. They're funnel shaped. They hide. These are almost always found growing among oak leaves, and I can't see them. I have a problem with this mushroom in that I just don't ever seem to be able to recognize it until someone points it out to me. But when you find these, you'll find them in abundance, and they are delicious. They're delicious fresh. They're delicious dried. They can be dried easily, and when they rehydrate, they come back in almost the exact shape that they were dried in. Chanterelles, regular chanterelles, the yellow chanterelles, don't do that. If you rehydrate them, they just come back kind of slimy and mushy. So I typically will dry them and grind them into a powder and use them as powdered mushroom. But black trumpets are out right now, and I would look for them in oak forests, hidden in the oak leaves, and if you find one, you're going to find a basketful. This is a common species of agaricus that shows up sometimes in lawns, often on pastures. It's called the meadow mushroom. It's actually the same genus as the mushroom I showed you earlier that was pushing up through the hard-packed gravel. Same genus. That one is Agaricus bisporus. This one is, or Bitchorus. This is Agaricus bisporus. Very closely related. Interesting mushroom in that the gills will go from being pink colored when they're fresh. And if you buy this one at the supermarket, if you buy the button mushroom, cut off the cap, you'll see that the gills are pink. Let that mushroom sit out for a couple of days, and you'll see that the mushrooms will turn brown, and it will produce that chocolate colored brown spore print that I showed you earlier. It also has a ring. And again, the dark colored gills and the dark spore print make it easily distinguishable from an Amanitas species. You might notice there's a kind of a blue colored mushroom sitting on the gills of that one overturned agaricus there. And that's a bluette, which is one of my favorite mushrooms in the whole world. And really, really tasty mushroom, and one bluette will flavor a whole dish. So in this case, I cooked up those agaricus, and I put that one bluette in there to give them added flavor. It's got the most mushroomy flavor, but it's not an easy one for beginners, so I'm not going to even talk about bluettes. That's when you have to know it to pick it. And the giant puffballs, once again, my late friend John. I've seen puffballs that get bigger than this, the size of a bushel basket. Even the small ones of this particular species, this is Clavatio gigantica, even the smaller ones are generally the size of softballs. However, all puffballs are edible, even the little ones that you might see growing on a log, as long as they're white inside. Okay, if you slice that puffball open and it's any color other than snow white and firm, don't eat it. Because there's a poisonous species that's purple inside, another poisonous species that's black inside. And any mushroom, even the white ones, the edible ones that are white inside, will turn yellow after a few days. Like even at this stage, here's a puffball that's actually split from humidity, just like a tomato will split if it's very humid. But when I took a chunk of it out, I can see that it's actually yellowish colored inside there. And so it's not, it's past prime. I would not eat this mushroom. When it's fresh, firm and white inside, it's a very tasty mushroom. Some books label it as choice. I wouldn't call it choice. I would call it good, but it's kind of bland. You know, you can cook it like a steak, but you really need to season it with butter or garlic or something like that. By the way, almost all edible mushrooms go good with some sort of garlic or onion or ramp in some cases. They like alliums. Chanterelles like to be eaten with fruit because they smell like apricots. That's another. I should have mentioned that. It's another characteristic of chanterelle mushrooms. If you gather them and put them in a basket or a plastic jug, such as I used to collect them, they have a distinct aroma of apricot, and they're good cooked with apricots and or peaches for that matter, and then finished off with some heavy cream. This is a mushroom that I'm eagerly awaiting. It's called a king bolete. It has pores, not gills, hence being called a bolete. Tend to find this one growing mostly under oak or in oak forests, but occasionally you'll see it under other hardwoods as well. Shows up late fall, and it's also called the cep, C-E-P, or porcini. This is probably the most commonly gathered wild mushroom in Europe, and I've been told that in any farmer's market during the fall in Europe, you will find people selling porcinis or cep. I've also heard it called Steinpilz, which I guess is the German name for it. Fairly common mushroom, fairly tasty. It's got one non-edible lookalike called the bitter bolete, which, again, this is another mushroom that I'll touch to my tongue just to see if it's really bitter. If it is, it's the bitter bolete. Even though it looks just like the king bolete, it is not. This is Boletus edulis. There's actually a complex of Boletus edulis. There's several different closely related species that are all good. I happen to find this one tastes better if it's dried and reconstituted than if you eat it fresh. I don't think it's a particularly tasty mushroom to eat fresh. All boletes should be sliced longitudinally for the presence of insect larvae. This mushroom gets very buggy very quickly, and again, this is the pore surface, which is easily detachable from the rest of the cap, but quite often you'll find lots of bugs inside here, and no one wants to eat buggy mushrooms. A few bugs I don't mind, but if it's really riddled with bugs, I generally don't eat it. This is a mushroom that shows up after frost. It's called the shaggy mane. Coprinus is the genus. White with a what shape would you call that cap? Again, this is where, is that cap rounded? Is it bell-shaped? I guess it's bell-shaped. But it's got a lot of scales on it. Quite often grows on wood chips. In this case, it's growing on wood chips that are buried beneath a lawn that never got mowed. So it's actually growing on wood chips, but it looks like it's growing out of grass. And I do sometimes see it in grassy areas, but usually it's growing on wood chips or some wooden substrate below it. I'm going to back up here if I may. Oh, I did back up. Okay. This is an interesting mushroom in that the gills will go from pink to black in a matter of 24 hours. This mushroom also exhibits the interesting characteristic of deliquescence. Deliquescence means it dissolves. It turns into a liquid. If you pick some inky caps and you put them in a plastic bag and you leave them in the sun, within 24 hours, you're going to have a plastic bag that is full of black ink. All right. I mean, they will absolutely dissolve into a black inky substance. And I guess that's how they shed their spores, but hence the name inky cap. So when you pick this one, make sure that the gills have not turned black, or it's not poisonous, but it's just not very palatable once the mushroom starts to deliquesce. And again, it's an October mushroom. There's a couple of species of Coprinus that appear earlier in the season. There's one that reacts with alcohol, which means that if you've consumed any alcohol on either end of a 24-hour period, you're going to get sick from that mushroom, which is why I've never eaten that mushroom. This is Maitake, which is also due to show up any day now. It's called hen of the woods, not to be confused with chicken of the woods. It is a pored mushroom, not a bolete, but it's called a polypore, as many of the mushrooms that grow as bracket fungi, including the reishi mushroom, including the pheasant's back or the dryad saddle. They're polypores. They have many pores on the undersurface. This one actually has a lot of overlapping shells or scales, almost always found at the base of large oak trees. Typically comes out in August through October. When they're abundant, they are very abundant, and the individual clusters can really be huge. as you can see in the slide here. On that particular one, I'm smiling because I cut the tender edges of this mushroom out, and I sold that at the farmer's market. And I think on one of these mushrooms, I think I might have made as much as $500 selling little baskets of this mushroom at the farmer's market, because I also set up a little frying pan and I was cooking these, and I was giving away free samples to anyone who happened to wander by. It's a very tasty mushroom, Grifola frondosa, and again, it's the Latin name for it. Or hen of the woods, and it's also considered to be an extremely medicinal mushroom, commonly used in traditional Chinese medicine as well as some other medicines as a medicine for various purposes. But it's a good mushroom. Doesn't always grow at the base of the oak trees every year, but some years it'll grow, and then it may take 5 or 6 years off before it grows again. So I've been lucky enough to be able to find these on old wolf type maple trees, or what I would call a wolf tree. Not maple, take that back, oak, either white or red oak. And the color varies. Again, the one that you just saw the slide of, well, it appears to be kind of light tan colored or gray, whereas this one, the cap is much, much darker. It's brown colored. All right, so the color of the cap can vary, but in many cases, it has these really large clusters of caps that grow together. I should know this, but I don't know what color the spore is. I would probably not one you're going to confuse with many other mushrooms. There's really nothing in the woods that looks like that. Certainly nothing toxic that looks like that. Once again, check for bugs. Because they do get buggy, and the fresh specimens that are just coming out are best, and they can go anywhere from a couple pounds to 10 or 15 pounds. Over here, this is my mushroom jug that I referred to. That's because I would put only one type of mushroom in that jug, and it would be a clean species. If I was gathering chanterelles, I would cut the base of them off so there's no dirt. When you gather mushrooms to eat, you don't want to get them dirty, and one dirty mushroom in your jug will make every mushroom dirty, and we don't recommend washing mushrooms except when you're just getting ready to eat them. At that point, it's perfectly okay to wash the mushrooms and get any dirt you want off right before you eat them. But if you wash these mushrooms, let's say you wash these as soon as you harvest them, they're going to get slimy in a couple of days and certainly not very palatable. So yes, you can certainly wash mushrooms right before you cook them to eat them. And then another thing about this jug that's nice, again, if this is half full, let's say with chanterelles, there might be a chanterelle right there. These are late season chanterelles. So if this jug was full of very clean chanterelles and you put your nose over it, you would get the distinct aroma of apricots. Very pleasant smell, very tasty mushroom. This is a basket. Now, lots of mushroom pickers will use a particular type of basket. Everybody's got their favorite basket. I guess this one's designed to stand up against the flat wall or something. And there's some black trumpets in there. There's some chanterelles in there. There's a couple of Boletus edulis here, a couple of king boletes that are in that basket. Baskets are nice because as you walk out of the woods, the spores from the mushroom are actually being shed out of the bottom of that wicker basket. And it's not uncommon, particularly with chanterelles, to find a trail of chanterelles along a path that you walked because of the spores that were shed by that mushroom. So baskets will shed spores. If you don't want anybody to find your chanterelle spot, put them in a jug like this because the spores won't spill out of that one. Of course, the Pacific Northwest is where you really find the big mushrooms. Like everything else out there, they're grandiose. And they have to harvest them with chainsaws out there. Obviously, it's a gag slide, but I'll tell you, the West Coast is where the mushrooms grow. There are professional mushroom gatherers on the West Coast, and if they don't pick 100 pounds of mushrooms in a day, it's considered a bad day. So, the Pacific Northwest is kind of like, that's where the mushrooms, the big mushrooms, and the abundant mushrooms grow. This is something that people think is a mushroom. It's called a ghost pipe. It's a higher plant. It's a seed plant that's lost its ability to grow chlorophyll, so it's white. It's the same color as a mushroom, so some people think it's a mushroom. It's not. It's a plant. This is actually a flower, and it's Monotropa is the name of the genus, Monotropa uniflora. And inside this, you're actually going to find seeds. Okay, so this is not a mushroom. Looks like a mushroom. It's white, grows off the roots of another plant. It's actually become a parasite, and it grows off the roots of plants. So Not a mushroom, not considered edible, but sometimes used as a medicine. Common name is ghost pipe, Monotropa uniflora. It's out there right now. So here are some of my axioms on mushroom hunting as I get older. And there's only so many bendovers in a day. And the older I get, again, inversely proportional to age, the older I get, the fewer bendovers. I'm getting really good at pointing at things with my stick and having someone else pick them up. So if you exceed the number of your allocated bendovers for a day, you get a backache. And I have one right now from yesterday's ginseng hunt. Of course, the recovery time is directly proportional to how many bendovers you made, extra ones. I've also learned that the longer you walk in the woods and the further you travel, the bigger your feet get. I happen to have size 12 shoes, and that's about what they feel like at 9 o'clock in the morning. As yesterday, when I started hunting ginseng at 10 a.m., by 5 o'clock, when I came out of the woods, my feet had grown into size 18 or larger, and I found myself tripping over everything that was out there. And I've also learned that the ground gets further away as the day goes on. If you fall down in the morning, it doesn't hurt nearly as much as if you fall down at 5 o'clock. And what was worth bending over for and picking up at 8 o'clock in the morning is not worth picking up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon because the ground's much further away. So don't do this at home. In this case, there's a bolete, and I am hoping it's a king bolete, and I am testing a little tiny piece of it on my tongue. If it's the king bolete, it'll taste sweet. If it's the bitter bolete, it'll taste bitter. I'll spit it out, and I won't waste my time with that particular mushroom because it's not palatable. I have a number of reference books. I do believe in cross-referencing mushrooms. If I can find something in one book, I will try to cross-reference it in 2 or 3 other books. Still probably not going to eat it unless someone else shows it to me, and they've eaten it. But this is the book that I like the most. This is the National Audubon Society Field Guide to Mushrooms. It's got a pictorial key. It's got a lot of great pictures in it. It's quite comprehensive, and it's got great descriptions in the back of the book. It's got great sections on lookalikes. It does distinguish edible from choice from good. Does mention the poisonous lookalikes, which I think is a really important characteristic. And by far, my favorite mushroom identification books. You should all buy one if you're going to hunt mushrooms. Anyway, I believe that completes my slides. That it does. And I'd like to thank you for listening. If you're still listening and watching, that's the thing about this remote learning. I can't be sure. I can't be looking out in the audience there and find out how many of you have nodded out, as I could if we were doing this in person. Anyway, I look forward to seeing some of you in person out at the Yarn Knot Forest. I believe we're going to do a little walk out there on September 19th. And if it keeps raining like it has been the past week, well, the woods should be dirty with mushrooms, and hopefully I'll be able to identify some of them for you. So once again, thanks for watching and listening. And I'll say goodbye for now.